First of all, I want to say Alhamdulillah. God gave me everything. Alhamdulillah.
I got one bodyguard. That's God. Oh, he's my bodyguard. He's your bodyguard.
I'm a Muslim. I believe in the religion of Islam.
The Quran is the word of God.
If you die tonight, Jerusalem will stay in the hands of the Franks. Strive therefore to take it, said Al-Adil to his brother Salahuddin when he was faced with two different choices. Assalamu alaikum, peace be upon you, and welcome to Elevating the Ummah. I'm Mahmoud Ahmad, and this is the second episode on Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi, or Saladin as he's prominently known in the West, the great Muslim hero and leader who has inspired countless of people and their imaginations. I reiterate from my previous podcast that from Salahuddin we'll learn many lessons, particularly how to navigate these times of a disunited ummah, which he himself faced. So, just a quick recap. In the last episode, we covered the early life of Salahuddin, which included his training and development, as well as early military experiences, and then his greater achievements, such as uniting Syria, Egypt, and many more Muslim states under one united banner. We also covered his many victories over the Crusaders, as well as one or two defeats. And the episode ended with the story of the Battle of Hattin, which was pretty much the decisive moment between who would go on to rule Jerusalem. Let's carry on from here. Salahuddin had two paths to choose from. He could now surmount an attack directly on Jerusalem and attempt to retake the city, or he could go for the 10 or so coastal cities first, which would provide the benefit that the inner cities and forts, which included Jerusalem, would be cut off from any potential reinforcements from Europe via sea. So, he opted to do just that, the coastal campaign. At first, he captured Acre, which was the second largest city of the Kingdom of Jerusalem. In addition to that, he captured other towns and cities such as Nazareth, Nablus, Beirut, Jubail, and so on. He stayed away from Tyre for the time being, as it was heavily fortified and supplied, and led by a charismatic and effective young leader, Conrad of Montferrat, who would go on to become a key player in future events. The city of Ascalon was given an ultimatum: either surrender the city and King Guy gets his freedom. Guy, king of Jerusalem, was captured by Salahuddin at the Battle of Hattin, or be ready for an invasion. These terms were taken to them by King Guy himself. At first, the city thought they could withstand Salahuddin and his army. After 10 days of being besieged, the city surrendered. At around this time, a delegation arrived from Jerusalem, which was summoned to discuss their terms of surrender. The Sultan wanted to enter the city with a peace treaty in line with the example set by Umar ibn al-Khattab radiallahu anhu, the second caliph, who annexed Jerusalem the first time around for Muslims. In accordance with Salahuddin's virtues, the terms were extremely fair. No assault, a peaceful surrender, the holy places would remain safe, and the Christians could leave with all their belongings. But the Christians refused. How could they give up the land where the person who they considered to be God had died? Other forts and garrisons surrendered more readily, including Gaza, Ramallah, and Bethlehem. All that remained of the Crusader kingdom was Tyre and Jerusalem, with a few forts in between. Which city should Salahuddin try to capture first? The thought of falling ill and passing away before capturing Jerusalem crossed his mind. After all, he had come close to death due to illness before. Now, Balian of Ibelin, a nobleman amongst the Crusaders, was in Tyre, but his wife was in Jerusalem. So he sent a request to Salahuddin, asking if he could go and retrieve his wife. The Sultan, ever generous, granted permission, stating that he could only stay there for one night. Balian reached Jerusalem, but apparently found it leaderless, and according to some sources, was pressured by the inhabitants to remain and lead their defense. He wrote an apology to Salahuddin, since he was going to break the promise. The Sultan, being the virtuous man that he was, forgave him. The siege of Jerusalem didn't last long. The knights, who were the core of the army, had been defeated at the horns of Hattin, so Balian desperately scrambled to get as many people as possible to defend the wall. The city seemed impregnable at first, but after some attempts and a change in tactic, only a week later it became in reach for Salahuddin. Balian and his entourage appeared before the Sultan to discuss terms of surrender. Salahuddin claimed he would not show mercy, to which Balian responded that he would kill all citizens and raze the city to the ground unless they were shown mercy. In contrast to his advisors, Salahuddin chose to deal with mercy. There was no massacre, no bloodshed. No one was raped, no one's possessions pillaged. The Christians were enslaved and given their ransom prices. Many were able to afford it, some not. Despite that, Salahuddin let many of those go free without paying ransom. He committed acts of charity and virtue, being kind and generous even to the wives and daughters of the knights at Hattin. On the 40th day of the conquest, all the Christians had evacuated. This was on 27th Rajab 583 after Hijri, the anniversary of the Prophet's Isra, or his journey to heaven from Jerusalem, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. His kindness shone even brighter since it was being compared to the brutal invasion of Jerusalem by the Christians during the First Crusade in 1099 CE. The bloodshed and scenes of horror were still remembered 3 generations later. Even relatively modern Christian and Western writers acknowledged the mercy and generosity of Salahuddin. The first Friday prayer to be offered in Jerusalem after 88 years was offered on the 9th of October 1187 Common Era at Al-Aqsa Mosque. The Christian cross was taken down from the Dome of the Rock. The crescent of Islam had once again risen over Jerusalem. The only place that remained in Christian control was Tyre, which was where most Christians fled to. They waited for reinforcements from Europe, and Europe was busy preparing them. 3 major European powers, on the behest of the Pope, were preparing their armies for what would come to be known as the Third Crusade. The German Emperor Barbarossa, the French King Philip, and the English King Richard the Lionheart all set out to reclaim the Holy Land from Salahuddin and the Muslims. But due to several hiccups and logistical issues along the way, the armies arrived exhausted and separately. The German Emperor, in fact, even drowned and died whilst crossing a river before reaching the Holy Land. In an effort to strike a political truce with the Christians of Tyre, Salahuddin released King Guy to go and take command from Conrad. Conrad denied this, and King Guy went back on his promise to Salahuddin. He went to Tripoli, which became his little kingdom. And from there, he set out and besieged Acre for a very lengthy 2-year siege. This was actually a siege within a siege, because whilst the Christian army had besieged the Muslim population of Acre, Salahuddin's Muslim army besieged the Christian army. As I mentioned, this was a lengthy siege lasting between 1189 and 1191 Common Era, a whole 2 years. These 2 years were exhaustive and indecisive for both sides. There would be minor advances for each side, but then minor setbacks straight away. The Christians had reinforcements coming in from Europe by the droves, mainly from England and France via ships. The Muslim inhabitants of Acre were continually in danger of starvation, with as many as 200 people dying a day. But each time, just before things got irreversibly bad, Salahuddin managed to get supplies to the city in the nick of time. The tide turned when a new player emerged on the scene, King Richard the Lionheart of England and half of France. He was young, handsome, and charismatic, and a true leader for the Christians, just what they needed. But filtering through the fanciful accounts of his virtues, John Mann, the biographer of Salahuddin, aptly described King Richard in the following words, and I quote, "He was both idealistic and mean, chivalrous and treacherous, a wonderful ally and a fearsome enemy, mercurial in turning from one to the other, a man equally in love with music and slaughter." End quote. He was also well financed by the Saladin tithe, a tax imposed on Christian Europe to gather funds to get revenge on Salahuddin. Anyway, Richard's arrival coincided with the already present King Philip of France's construction of catapults, and they bombarded the city walls ruthlessly. Eventually, the city's defences and morale broke down with the walls, and they drew up their surrender terms with the Christians, citing Salahuddin's seal. When Salahuddin heard of this, he didn't want to agree, but alas, he saw the Christian banners being raised in the city. Acre was lost to the Muslims. The Christians repeated the unspeakable atrocities to the Muslim inhabitants, just as they had done when they captured Jerusalem almost a century earlier. King Richard made quick work of re-Christianizing the city and taking Muslim prisoners. The terms of surrender presented to Salahuddin included handing over the city's population, treasure, military stores, ships, Christian prisoners, and the relic of what Christians believed to be the true cross. During negotiations, however, the truce broke down and Richard went on to commit a great atrocity. On the 16th of July, 1191 Common Era, Richard had 2,600 Muslim prisoners of war executed in front of Salahuddin and his army, who attempted to rescue them but were fended off. This was described by John Mann in the following words, and I quote, 2,600, not many, perhaps, by the standards of a modern genocide, but a show of brutality far beyond anything done by Saladin. It is not a question of numbers. This was a political act, revealing the difference between personalities and between cultures. What a difference between the generosity of Saladin, as a Muslim, usually, not always, showed to his enemies, and the ruthlessness that Richard, as a Christian, showed to his. End quote. That sums it up pretty well. Even non-Muslim sources and biographers are compelled to admit of Salahuddin's virtuous and kind treatment of Christian prisoners of war, in line with Islamic injunctions. In a way, the contrast between the treatment of prisoners of war between the two sides serves as a great form of preaching the message of Islam. Anyway, this didn't change the fact that Acre was lost to the Muslims. King Richard established himself in the Grand Palace, King Philip of France returned home, King Guy remained king, by name, until the remainder of his life, and Conrad would be king after him. Richard would now turn his attention towards Jerusalem, or at least he would have liked to. With Jerusalem in mind, he began marching along the coast. Salahuddin's army marched in parallel, and small skirmishes broke out every now and then. When the city of Arsuf came into sight, the Muslims set up their defences and the Christians prepared to attack. The battle was hard fought, going one way then the other. Eventually, the Christians emerged victorious, and this is a victory that's considered to be the equivalent to what the Battle of Hattin was for the Muslims, which of course is not a fair comparison, since the Muslims completely crushed the Frankish Christian forces at the Battle of Hattin. At Arsuf, the Muslims, though defeated, were not completely crushed. They regrouped and marched on. The city of Ascalon was next, and upon realizing the futility of defending the city without further reinforcements, Salahuddin decided to evacuate the entire city and burn it to the ground. Richard still settled in the city and spent the next 4 months rebuilding it as much as he could. Negotiations between the two groups began, but no agreement was in sight. Richard began losing his zeal to retake Jerusalem, and there were other issues to deal with. King Guy was replaced with Conrad as a supposed king of Jerusalem, but Conrad was assassinated soon after by the assassins of Sinan. Although Richard managed to get an advantage by raiding a caravan which was on its way to reinforce and resupply Salahuddin's army from Egypt, he wasn't able to play on that advantage because Salahuddin still had the upper hand in the defense of Jerusalem. Richard returned to diplomacy, and Salahuddin entertained the idea, but again, the negotiations broke down. In 1192 Common Era, one final time, Salahuddin and Richard faced each other, this time at the Battle of Jaffa, which was to be the last battle of the Third Crusade. It was an exhausting battle for both sides, and ended as a draw. But the exhaustion overwhelmed Richard, who broke down into a fever. He was tired, exhausted, and unwell, and now Salahuddin decided it was the right time to talk about peace terms. On the 2nd and 3rd of September, terms were agreed and the Treaty of Ramlah was signed by both rulers, such as Christian pilgrims being given permission to enter Jerusalem without being taxed, but the Christians would have to give up Ascalon and Salahuddin would not give up the supposed remnants of the true cross. The end of the Third Crusade was described by Abdullah Nasih Ulwan, the biographer of Salahuddin, in the following words, and I quote, "Thus, the Third Crusade, in which many people were killed, cities were destroyed, the German emperor was drowned, and France and England lost elite soldiers, ended after 5 years. During those years, the Franks achieved nothing but the occupation of Acre. Europe was the loser because their losses were much greater than their gains. The Muslims did not have even a span of Palestine before the advent of Salahuddin. Now, after the Battle of Hattin and the Treaty of Ramlah, Palestine came under Muslim control save the narrow part between Tyre and Acre." End quote. With this, the Third Crusade ended, and so Richard began his journey home, only to be chased and imprisoned by the King of Austria, and after he was ransomed, he eventually met his death in result of an injury he received from an arrow. Stephen Runciman, in his History of the Crusades, summed up Richard's life in the following words, and I quote, "He was a bad son, a bad husband, and a bad king, but a gallant and splendid soldier." End quote. Back in Palestine, Salahuddin spent some time putting state affairs in order, after which he returned to Damascus. He met various delegations and citizens, fulfilling his duties as ruler. But he was evidently getting weaker. His health was deteriorating, despite his busy schedule and occasional hunting trips. The Sultan had always wanted to perform the Hajj, but due to affairs of the state he was unable to, and now it seemed as if his time on this earth was numbered. He fell ill, yellow fever according to some, and gradually deteriorated over the next 12 days. On the morning of Wednesday the 4th of March, 1193 Common Era, as a sheikh sat beside the mighty Sultan, reciting the Holy Quran, he reached the words, "Allah is sufficient for me. There is no God but He. In Him I have put my trust." Salahuddin's face radiated and brightened, and then his soul returned to its creator. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. The Muslim Ummah had not felt such a heavy loss since the demise of the fourth Rashidun Khalifa, Ali ibn Talib radiyallahu anhu. Citizens gathered in the streets to mourn the noble Sultan. He was washed as per the burial rituals and put into his coffin. All the products used for his burial had to be borrowed, since he himself owned little material wealth, despite being the mightiest sultan of his time. He was 57 years old, and his estate was 47 dirhams and 1 dinar. He left no land, no garden, no farm, nor any property. A true manifestation of a musafir, a traveller of this world. But not having any worldly belongings doesn't mean he didn't have anything of value. Salahuddin Ayyubi had many valuable qualities, such as his piety and worship, justice and mercy, courage and perseverance, understanding and forgiveness, chivalry and generosity. So that was the end of the life of the unifier of Islam, Sultan Salahuddin Ayyubi. What was the legacy he left behind, and the lessons we can learn and apply in our own lives? Well, for starters, it seemed like having a grand vision is of utmost importance. Salahuddin had in mind to unify the Ummah and retake Jerusalem from the Crusaders. It was a slow and gradual process. It took decades. But the vision, which was grander and nobler than Salahuddin himself, required patience to materialize. And we should remember that too. Having a vision, something nobler than ourselves, is important if we want to achieve anything significant, and more likely than not, the greater the vision, the longer it will take for it to be realized. So, we must have patience. Another lesson we learn from him is integrity. He was honest and just, and he'd always keep his promises, both to friend and foe. Even if it seemed like there would be some sort of temporary benefit to breaking a truce or agreement at some points, and even despite the insistence of some advisors, Salahuddin never broke his promise. He is quoted to have once said, "If we refuse what we have promised and are not generous with the benefits, no one will ever trust us again." A beautiful explanation of the reason behind Salahuddin's success was given in light of the Quranic verse, which I'll quote. "Verily, Allah will help those who help His cause. Truly, Allah is all-strong, almighty. Those Muslim rulers who, if we give them power in the land, they order for iqam as-salat, to pay the zakat, and they enjoin al-ma'ruf, and forbid al-munkar. And with Allah rests the end of all matters." When the Muslim Ummah in every time and place follows the guidance and meaning of this verse, prepares the means of victory, and strives truthfully to achieve it, Allah will surely aid them and make them achieve their aims of victory, honor, glory, and superiority. Perhaps the most important lessons for us as an Ummah can be found in the era of Salahuddin Ayyubi, because if we are to draw a parallel, as some historians and biographers have done, between the Muslim Ummah who recaptured Palestine under the leadership of Salahuddin and the modern day where the Muslim Ummah has lost control over most of Palestine, it is the contrasts of the conditions of the Muslims from both eras which led to each result. The Muslims in Salahuddin's time were in great moral and spiritual condition. They would fight for the sake of Allah and keep themselves busy in His remembrance, whereas some Muslim armies of this era supposedly kept photos of models, actresses and artists to spur them on during war. The moral and spiritual state of Muslims in our day and age is clearly in decline. Another reason why the Muslims were successful in the Battle of Hattin was the fact that they set aside their differences, quarrels and disputes. They were politically united under one rule. But in our day, Muslim leaders, be they kings or presidents, are at each other's throats, steeped in disputes and quarrels. This disunity is bound to weaken the Muslims as a nation. And one of the most important contrasts lies in the fact that the Muslims at the Battle of Hattin showed interest in both their word and deed. They would set out to fulfill what they claimed to achieve. In this day and age, in general, Muslims give their word but often don't follow it up with their deeds. This applies to defending their borders as well as everyday dealings. Until we back up our words with our deeds, we won't make any progress. There are many other issues that can be mentioned, such as the inclination towards nationalism, or making it an Arab and non-Arab issue, all of which was put aside in the time of Salahuddin Ayyubi. The unity of the Ummah is the only way for Muslims to take the lead on the world stage once again. As always, remember the purpose of this podcast. We need to elevate the Ummah to greater standards. The best way forward is to elevate ourselves spiritually, mentally and physically, and work towards a brighter future. We must learn to set aside our differences and find strength in unity. I kindly request you to rate this podcast and share it with your friends and family. And stay tuned for more inspirational stories in the future, inshallah. With peace, Assalamu alaikum.